The CV Dynamic Connector object allows you to make tank treads, beaded necklaces, Jacob's ladders, and even wriggling creatures with ease. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use the CV Connector object in order to create a lot of these effects. Here is a very simple use case for this tool set. I've got a bunch of cubes that I've cloned, and when I press play, nothing is happening, so they're not dynamic yet. In order to make them dynamic, I'm going to first select my cloner object, and to it, I'm going to add a CV Dynamic Connector object, which you can get from the Plugins menu under CV Dynamic Connector object. Now, after I add this, I want to drag my cloner inside of my connector object. And you'll know that it's working because almost immediately, it's changed the colors of your objects. And I can turn on Create Connector right here, and what that's going to do is create a hinge object that lives at the center between each of these objects here. So now when I press play, I'm seeing a dynamic effect as this object falls and hits these cubes. So if I want, I can come in here and turn off Ignore Collisions, and it's now going to behave as you would more likely expect. So let's take a look at a slightly more complex example. It looks very similar to the previous one. I've got a cloner, again, with a bunch of cubes. And what I want to have happen is for these cubes to fall and unfold as they hit these pegs. So I'm going to select my cloner. I'm going to hold down Alt or Option as I add my CV Dynamic Connector object. And then I'm just going to press play. And we'll see that these objects are sort of unfolding as they go. And because this is a reflectance-based scene, I'm going to go into my display options and turn off colorized segments so that we can see this a little bit more easily. So now as it's hitting, it's sort of slinkying on its way down. But what I want, again, is for it to unfold. So in order to achieve that, what I want to do is give CV Connector object a hint as to where it should make these connections. So I'm going to take my first object here, and I'm just going to rotate it 2 degrees on bank. So it's just going to tilt it slightly in one direction. And then I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to set it to -2 in the opposite direction. And you'll see now that it is going a little bit closer at each of these areas, sort of zigzagging up and down. And the thing that makes this possible is in my cloner object, I've got fixed clone turned off. With it on, it just restores it back to a default position. So back in my CV Connector object, we'll see that there are these little dots connecting up our object in between each of our shapes. And right now it's connecting based on the sides of my box. If I change it to box edges, it is going to locate the edges that are closest to each other in my bounding box. And if I go ahead and add a hinge connector object, maybe scale it down so it's just a little bit smaller and less distracting. If I now look through my camera here and press play, we'll see that each of these segments is unfolding and sort of unhinging in the way that we designed. In this project, I want to show off the ability to fix the start and end of a group of clones. Normally with these, the start and end options off, these would just sort of fall. So if I turn off anchor end, for example, the object gets released and they all fall like so. I can also turn it back on and sort of restore this, and we get this animation right here. So this is really nice for creating hanging rope bridges, things of that nature. The next thing that I want to show off is a feature called loop. I'm going to have it off by default and press play on this animation. And what we see is that our beaded necklace falls and then just breaks apart as it hits the top of this object. And that's because the first and the last clones in my cloner don't know about each other. So I'm going to turn on loop, and it's just going to add a single connection point, which you can just barely see happening right up there. And now when I press play, the top parts are connected with each other, and it's a nice strong hold. You can get an animation like this. Now, you're not limited to just using simple cubes. You can also use more complex shapes like these tank treads here, which I've connected together using the axis placement mode, which is taking a very carefully placed axis inside of my object and applying my connector in that location. Now, if you've ever set up a dynamics simulation before on your own, especially with connector objects, you might have noticed that it's really challenging to exactly place your connectors where you want them to be. And you might end up with something that looks like this, where objects are hinging and rotating from the wrong spot, especially if they're different sizes. Well, CV Dynamic Connector Object makes it possible to automatically adjust the placement of your connectors. So this is something that you might see just trying to put the connectors in between the center points of your objects, or the axes of your objects. If I go to my connector object, I can change my connection point here from box centers to box sides. And what you'll notice is that there's a little orange dot that appears indicating where these are going to connect, and a little white dot saying which side is being referenced. And now we've got connectors that are exactly between each of these shapes, even accounting for the differences in size. So as I press play, I get an animation that is a lot more appealing. Now, in addition to this, I've got a couple other modes. I can use axes modes, which are going to use the actual physical axes of my objects, and I can even slide the connection point left and right between those two. I can even use box edges, which we used in an earlier video, and by default, this connects with the bottommost edge if there are no edges that are clearly closer to each other, and just sliding these back and forth like so allows me to exactly adjust where they are hinging from. Now, because the CV Dynamic Connector Object leverages the power of Cinema 4D's built-in dynamic system, you can actually use all of the dynamics force objects, including those for the simple particles like turbulence and friction. And those are controlling each and every one of these automatically generated connector objects. And if you ever wanted to adjust one of these once you made this editable, you know it can be a bit of a pain. So right here is a selection object you can double click on, and you will get access to each of these connectors. So I'm just going to hit undo here and hit play again. And there we are. We've got all of our connectors, including clones of clones, automatically connecting to each other. Okay, this has been a whirlwind tour of the CV Dynamic Connector Object. There is full documentation online, and I'm very curious to see what you come up with. Please tweet at Cineversity with any images or animations that you create using the CV Dynamic Connector Object.